We resume part two of Dennis Turner's stories of his firing days at Weymouth with another trip that nearly proved disastrous. He was booked to work the 1915 parcels train to Westbury. His driver was Wally Stroud, another affable and easygoing man. Often this term was used as a running intern for a newly shopped Swindon works engine that had been overhauled, Manor or a Grange, but this day it was a standard 4MT class 260 number 76009. Not an engine Denis knew, and although he thinks it may have been a Bournemouth engine, it was a stranger to him. Denis admits that he was not a great lover of these engines, as they were too small for his liking, but capable enough of what they had to do. Denis set about preparing the engine for the job, and as soon as he got on the footplate, Denis blew the gauge glass through to check the water level in the boiler, as he always did. However, he couldn't see the level, and it appears that the boiler had been filled to the gunnels. This was not unusual, as their steam raiser, Geordie, would often fill the boiler levels right up to save him checking the engines again in a hurry, and he was on duty that day. Denis blew the gauge glass 2 or 3 times more, but was not happy with what he saw, so he called Wally up onto the footplate and showed him. After checking a couple of times more, they both reached the same conclusion, that there was indeed water in the boiler, as they could see movement, but that the boiler was far too full and there was a danger that the engine may prime under load. Priming occurs when an overfull boiler fails to condense water correctly to steam, as there is insufficient room for it to do so. Instead of steam driving the cylinders, water can be pushed through with the danger that overcompression could lead to severe damage, although what normally happened was that the water would be exhausted out of the chimney, cascading everywhere, which caused the engine to malfunction. During this time, experiments were being conducted with water softener tablets in the tender to soften hard water to prevent limescale building up in the boiler. The problem with that was that it made the engine prime far more easily, and often the boiler water levels would be kept lower than normal to avoid this happening. He and Wally therefore agreed that he would keep the boiler pressure down to avoid the safety valves lifting, which caused even more problems with an overfull boiler, and having only briefly used the injectors to wash the footplate down, they were quickly off shed and back onto their train. They had no delay and departed quickly, with Denis still checking the boiler levels regularly. Steam pressure was fine, and they passed through Radipole Halt and on towards Upway and Broadway, about 4 miles up the track. They'd only just gone about half a mile Dorchester side of Upway station when there was a huge bang and the cab filled with steam. Wally quickly brought the train to a halt, and they rapidly realised to their horror that the fusible plug in the crown of the firebox had gone. The plug is there for safety, and it consisted of a hard metal bolt with the centre drilled out. This was filled with lead as a plug. This photo shows the crown of the firebox showing the fusible plug. If the level of the water becomes low enough to uncover the lead core of the plug, to avoid extensive boiler damage, the lead will melt and the steam emitted will extinguish the fire. A dropped plug was the footplate crew's worst nightmare, and as Wally went back to get assistance, Denis set about dropping the fire out of the firebox to prevent any further damage. They were now about halfway up Bincombe Bank, blocking the main line and helpless. Eventually, an engine came up from Weymouth and they were hauled ignominiously back down to Weymouth with a wrong line order form. Disaster upon disaster for Denis and his mate Wally, and they ran over the sequence of events time and time again, but could not reach any other conclusion that they had done the right thing. In the subsequent inquiry, they were both exonerated, as it was discovered that the top gland of the water gauge was blowing through and was giving an incorrect reading of the boiler water levels. Relief for them both, yes, but it did not make Denis feel any better about the whole sorry incident, and to this day he wished it had never happened. It has to be said that the steam raiser's actions needed close scrutiny, because for the boiler to have been as low as it apparently was, showed that it had not been checked for many hours before they got aboard the engine. However, no further action was taken other than repairing the engine, which, according to records, was withdrawn on the 9th of July 1967 and scrapped at Cashmore's yard on the 1st of January 1968. Another happier story involves another ex-Dorchester driver, Bill Perkins, a southern engineman through and through, and a top-rate one at that. He was Denis's driver one day on the fast Weymouth to Waterloo, the 5:35 p.m. up to Bournemouth. Denis was still a fairly young hand on the shovel, and because he fired a lot on former GWR locos, he was still firing right-handed. They had a channel packet. Denis forgets which one, and as Denis was getting the fire ready to climb out of Weymouth up the bank, Bill suddenly said, "Here, mate, get your arse out of my face." It took Denis aback a bit, but he decided, not at a good time on a fast up, to fire left-handed, and from then on he never looked back. Bill was a kindly bloke, and he did say to Denis that if he was struggling he could revert, but being a stubborn young so-and-so, Denis never did. As the 1960s drew on, it became patently obvious that steam-hauled trains were soon to be consigned to the dustbin of history. More and more diesel locos were appearing, and more steam engines were disappearing. Their sturdy little pannier tanks slowly went to be replaced by Drury diesel shunters in some cases, and in others by Ivat 2MT tanks, some of which had been displaced from places like Guildford upon the closure of lines such as the Horsham branch. Denis recalls 41392, 41324, 41296 and 41284 arriving, and these engines caused some consternation with drivers. Although they were perfectly sound engines, they were larger and gave less vision when working them down the tramway to Weymouth Quay, as they were also to replace the sturdy little GWR built 1366 class pannier tanks that had served the line so well. The LDC, local union reps, were consulted and a ban imposed on the use of these engines on the line. However, after some trials, this decision was reversed and the engines were used without any problem on the route. Denis came to like these little tank engines as they were roomier on the footplate than the GWR panniers, and you were less likely to scrape your knuckles when firing on them. The cabs were comfortable and the engines were free steaming. By the mid-1960s, beaching branch lines around Weymouth were being closed. The Abbotsbury branch had already closed back in 1959, and the Bridport branch was under threat, as was the Swanage branch. Swanage was worked by Bournemouth drivers, but Weymouth crews used to go as far as Fursbrook to collect the Kimmeridge clay wagons. Denis had also worked the branch when on loan to Bournemouth as a fireman, and he mustn't forget working the Bournemouth Bell Express when on loan to Bournemouth, but only from Bournemouth West to Bournemouth Central. So it was in 1965 that Denis found that he was selected together with his driver at the time, Les Moore, who became a shed foreman at Weymouth, to work the last passenger train across the Portland branch before its closure. Because of the train weight and to avoid runaround problems, it was decided to have an Ivat tank at the front of the train and an Ivat tank coupled at the rear. Their engine was number 41324, and the rear end crew were driver Dave Pointer and fireman Terry Bush, who worked number 41284. The guard was the lovely Fred Hooper, another smiley man with a rakishly angled hat. 3 packed trains went across to Portland on that momentous day, with crowds all along the track. Make no mistake, this line was a thing of scenic beauty, with superb views across Portland Harbour at one stage, and as they climbed the steep incline from Portland Square to Easton, the views along the Dorset coastline were breathtaking, now called the Jurassic Coast. Whoever decided to close this line had no vision, no business acumen, and needed locking up. It's now a nature trail and is enjoyed by many people as the beautiful walk it is. The mid-1960s saw a speeding up in the change of motive power at Weymouth with increased dieselisation. High-mech hydraulic and brush-type Ford diesels were becoming more and more commonplace, and the first time Denis sat opposite Ivor in comfort on a brush-type Ford diesel, he was blown away by the ease with which it hauled 12 coaches up Bincombe and flew through the tunnel at the top at over 40 miles an hour, with a clear view right through the tunnel. At first, it was a novelty, but as time wore on, Denis realised that this was the beginning of the end for steam, and also the beginning of the end for a great number of staffing jobs that steam required to function correctly. Most steam engines were having little expended upon them during the 1960s, and it was amazing that crews could still get the best out of them most of the time. Swindon Works was still trying to send out engines from their shops with as much pride as they could muster, and around 1960 to 1961, Denis clearly recalls a Weymouth BR Standard Class 5MT number 73029 going away to Swindon for a major refit, only to reappear looking like new in a beautiful GWR Brunswick green colour. The story was that the foreman fitter at Swindon used up some of the last of the GWR paint on 73029. As the writing was on the wall for Swindon Works, it was the last gasp from a great loco works. It was great to see her come back gleaming, like a new engine resplendent in green instead of the dull black. One of Denis's favourite fives at Weymouth, but they were going to lose her to 9 Elms before much longer. 73029 was the last Weymouth loco to have such a refit. One other memory was of working a very fine engine in terrible condition visually. It must have been late in 1964 that Denis and his driver at the time, Les Moore, were booked to work the 9 AM passenger up from Weymouth to Westbury. On arrival at work, expecting to find a high-mech diesel, they instead found a Castle-class loco, number 5018, St Maur's Castle, waiting for them. Denis's joy at the thought of working this engine turned to sadness at the sight of this once magnificent locomotive, which now looked like a rust heap. It had been withdrawn from service with the onslaught of diesel hydraulics, but because these diesels were so unreliable, hastily withdrawn steam engines occasionally had to be put back into service to cover shortages. Such was the case of number 5018. The records show that this engine was withdrawn in March 1964 and scrapped at Cohen's at Kettering in December of that year, so Denis is guessing that the official records may not show the fact that it was put back in service for a period of time. In spite of its appearance with rust everywhere, which Denis tried to improve upon on the footplate by using copious amounts of engine oil, this engine performed magnificently and was such a pleasure to work and ride on. He got off the footplate at Westbury with a mixture of pride and sadness that this wonderful machine would soon be back on the scrap heap, having had only a very short reprieve from its fate. This photo, taken by Peter Quilly only 2 years previously, shows Castle Class number 5018 St Maur's Castle in beautiful condition, standing outside the repair shop at Old Oak Common on the 9th of September 1962. Another bizarre move by railway management in the early 1960s was the decision to completely refurbish the turntable at Weymouth's loco sheds. By now, the writing was on the wall, and why so much was spent on this task, Denis still doesn't know. The engine crews learnt of the decision and also were told that a fleet of BR Standard Class 4MT tank engines were to be shedded at Weymouth for the duration of the turntable refit. To the best of Denis's knowledge, a period of about 6 weeks, he seems to recall. It wasn't a popular move, but in the best traditions of footplate men everywhere, they got on with the job in hand. Whilst he was sure that many would say that tank engines were fine for the job they were built for, it was stretching credibility to expect them to perform on fast trains as well as the larger engines they temporarily replaced. As a result, many trains ran late because they were underpowered and lacked the speed required. It was an experience that Denis cannot say he enjoyed, especially working them on the main line, as they had insufficient coal storage in the bunker, limited room on the footplate, and the main problem was that their water capacity was hopeless for the task they were given, which meant stopping for water at places where they would not normally stop. So it was that they breathed a sigh of relief when the turntable refit was completed, which for some reason was handed back for them painted in a glorious GWR chocolate and cream paint finish. Enthusiasts, since in the end, were by now everywhere, and any steam-hauled train they tried to give them a good show. By now, Denis was in the passenger link and his driver was Vic Lucas. Vic had transferred up to London in the late 1950s and had been driving commuter trains in and out of Charing Cross up until he came back to Weymouth on his preference move. The last day of steam was scheduled for Sunday the 9th of July 1967, and as Denis worked that weekend, he was present as the fateful day arrived and watched as one by one steam engines came to the shed and had their fires dropped, never to be lit again, with a few exceptions. Weymouth loco sidings filled up with dead steam locos, where they stayed for months only to be eventually taken away in 2s, 3s and 4s with side rods disconnected and strapped to the running plates to meet their fate in Wales and elsewhere. For most railwaymen, it was a very sad time and also a very unsettling one, because it became clear more and more men were losing their jobs. The next series of photographs taken by Keith Robertson show these once magnificent locomotives being hauled away from Weymouth Motive Power Depot to await their fate with the cutter's torch. A truly sorry sight. All the paraphernalia relating to steam engines were loaded into open wagons and taken away for scrap. Items that any preservation society today would give their eye teeth for. Now they were just classed as worthless junk. Initially, Denis didn't think anybody seriously thought that steam had gone forever, but that realisation slowly dawned as over a period of time the loco sheds became empty places, with only the ghosts of what was lingering on. It was hurtful to see the destruction of all the commitment and skill of the most dedicated railway staff, and by the end of 1968 Denis knew that he had to move on, as he would be out of work at the age of 23. BR Standard Class 3MT number 77014 had the dubious honour of being the very last locomotive to work a steam-hauled train working the 2120 vans from Bournemouth to Weymouth on the 9th of July 1967. Denis recalls that sometime around 1960 he wrote to Swindon Works to ask how much it would cost him to purchase a Duke Dog number plate from an engine that had been recently scrapped. He believes it was number 9015. It was a solid brass plate and still has the letter in reply, telling him that he could purchase the plate as scrap for the priceless sum of 30 shillings plus carriage. He also inquired about the purchase of nameplates from withdrawn castles and other named locomotives, and was similarly informed that he could buy one for £15 plus carriage. Like many, how he wished now that he had bought a couple. Denis did buy a cast iron cab plate from a former Weymouth mogul, number 6344, when it was scrapped, plus some other bits and pieces, but when he got married and had children, money was tight, so they were sold to keep the wolf from the door. Looking at railway auction websites on the internet now, such things are exchanging hands for vast sums of money. But returning to Denis's situation after the withdrawal of steam, so it was then that he, together with 3 other Weymouth firemen, cousins Dave and Alec Penny, plus Dave Squibb, applied for driving jobs in the London area. The fathers of both Pennies, as well as Dave Squibb's dad, were signalmen, 2 at Weymouth and 1 at Dorchester Junction. They all applied for different depots and in different areas of London, so it was a great surprise to the 4 of them when they found out that they'd all been offered driving jobs at the same depot, Dorking North. Alec and Denis were posted to the western side of Dorking North, and Dave Penny and Dave were posted to the south central side, but all sharing the same driver's office. In January 1969, the 4 of them set off for the smoke. Denis was the only single person out of the 4 of them. They left Weymouth on the Royal Wessex, the 0735X Weymouth to Waterloo. Denis's old driver, Ivor Foote, came to see him off and said, "You'll be back in a couple of years." Denis reminded Ivor many years later about it, and he chuckled and said he was wrong. Denis never did return to his hometown to live, and as Denis relayed this to me at the beginning of 2012, almost 43 years later, now living in France, he realised that apart from spending many holidays there, and at one time owning a holiday home in the resort, moving away was the right thing to do, although he always missed not living next to the sea. But on that January day in 1969, they arrived at Dorking and went across to Red Hill to see the shedmaster there, as it was his area that Dorking fell under at the time. As they couldn't find any suitable accommodation, for the first 6 months or so, they all lived in shared caravans on Box Hill during severe winter conditions, and they wondered what the hell they were doing there, especially the married lads. In the meantime, they got on with the job of learning the suburban routes and getting to know a host of new railway colleagues who were, apart from the accent, no different to those they had left behind in Dorset. Denis also attended a course to learn the new, to him, electric traction he would be driving, although the stock was hardly new, as it had been around since the 1930s. At the time, I reminded him that the juice training was held at the prefab huts at Waterloo Southside, which was accessed via the cut. I also reminded him that one of the instructors at the time was Bob Phillips, and Denis was fairly sure that it was Bob that took the course, and also passed him out for driving. Denis spent the next 3 years driving suburban trains in and around the London area, with Waterloo as the main London terminus. So it was then that he experienced both ends of the Waterloo to Weymouth line, but in completely different circumstances. Drivers he worked with at Dorking included Ned Weller, Mick Rosewell, Norman Laws, he who had a window cleaning business part-time and would tell any lady who complained that he had not done the corners of the windows correctly, he would do them next time, madam. Denis should have remembered that many years later, when they employed him to do the windows of the police house they came to live in Dorking. On the whole, Denis enjoyed the job he transferred into, but in some respects, perhaps, he could have been happier had he been posted to one of the mixed traction depots that he'd applied for instead of a suburban depot, as much as he liked Dorking and the Surrey area. The 3 others Denis transferred from Dorset with continued their careers on the railway, eventually transferring back to Weymouth on their preference moves, where they all retired with a full railway service. However, Denis became unsettled, and in 1972 he decided that with steam gone forever, it was not the job he joined, and he could not see himself remaining as a motorman for the remainder of his working life. So Denis resigned and eventually started a new career with Surrey Police, which he did for the next 30 years. Instead, where many years after leaving the railway, he got reacquainted with a certain Jeff Birch. But that, as they say, is another story. Sadly, following a long illness, Denis passed away in June 2022. I'm so glad that I managed to persuade Denis to write a chapter of his life on the railway, and some of his story and photographs are now held within the National Archives and available for anyone to view forever. I will certainly miss Denis, as we shared lots of great memories and similar experiences when working on BR, especially back in the steam days when we were young firemen.